morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Peggy Seidel, and I'm the president of the Friends of the Montana Historical Society, and we are sponsoring our program this morning with Zoanne Stoltz. Zoanne is the research historian for the Montana Historical Society Research Center. After growing up in eastern Montana and raising 3 daughters in the northwestern corner of the state, Zoanne pursued her dream of becoming a public historian. To this end, she graduated Phi Beta Kappa and magna cum laude from Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts and earned her master's in history from the University of Montana. As a reference historian, Zoanne's career combines her two passions, the people and history of Montana. Her current projects include outreach programs that introduce students to the thrills of research, as well as a study of the Montana Historical Society cookbook collection and Montana food waste. Please welcome Zoanne. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Look, I've got a clicker. I love these things. Let me see. I want to be sure that I know what I'm doing. Yes. Okay. Post-World War. We all know how the movies portray World War I, and we've seen cowboy movies, but have you ever just thought of what happens when the two of them come together? What happens when a homesteader has to face the realities of post-World War I? What happens when a governor has to face the realities of a state going to war? Or for that matter, a governor who has to figure out, who sees thousands and thousands of the state's residents leaving because they're starving to death and they're losing their homesteads, thousands of homesteads every week. One of the things I feel are neglected are those mothers and wives and sisters and daughters who lost the men in their lives. We don't hear about that much. So today, you're going to hear all about my favorite things having to do with coming out of World War I and perhaps some of the things that I'm cranky about. And I will do my darndest to get you excited about history. All right, so a little bit of acclamation here. World War I took place at what historians often consider the end of the progressive era. How many people are familiar with that term, progressive era? So not very many. Okay. Have you heard of the Gilded Age? The Gilded Age. The age we're about to become industrialized. We are in the process of becoming industrialized. We've got robber barons, and I mean Montana's got robber barons. We have downstairs the Copper Company records. It's shocking the power behind that organization. We have downstairs the records left behind the banks that crashed after the 1893 crash of silver. And there have been a couple really interesting papers written about our community fathers and why they stayed in business after the crash, but the blacksmiths on the corner did not. That's another story. All right, so we have the Gilded Age, and we're all familiar with that, but coming out of the Gilded Age, we have the Progressive Era. And in Montana, that traditionally is thought of to last with Governor Dixon. And I will be getting into that. But the Progressive Era was a reaction to the industrialization of the United States and to the frustration of, shall we say, a huge public who were tired of the abuses of the corporations. There was an incredible inequity there, and they recognized that. It's also during the time, it's also the time where we come up with, I call them the ologies. We get sociology, psychology, historiography. Education becomes something to be respected, not something that is just for a few people. And so there's this rather interesting cycle that begins. We also, during the Progressive Era, see growths in how things are administered in maintaining records. It seems so trite, but administration and how things are run becomes a part of the Progressive Era's movement. They're worried about immigration. Not everything in the Progressive Era is fun. It's the Progressive Era in the United States that comes with up with the idea of eugenics, right? And I remember reading a paper from that era where they talk about dark-haired, dark-skinned people should not be marrying blonde-haired, blue-eyed people, and that describes my mom and dad. And I thought, whoa, it's a good thing mom and dad would have ignored those types of rules, because I would not be here. But we also have women's suffrage, right? We have the growth of the Food Administration, sanitation, that sort of thing. It just goes on. And I'd be more than happy to talk all day about this, but I've got to get going. I just wanted you to know what's happening in the country. And we do see that era immediately after World War I, Montana going from the Gilded Age through the Progressive Era and into the modern era on so many levels. Oh, prohibition. Oh my gosh, how did Montanans live during Prohibition? We talked about the Irish and Butte. Okay, I'm German Catholic. Oh my gosh, I just can't imagine, but that's another thing. Okay. So the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, Armistice. And Montana has been through the ringer, as has the entire country. But I am going to talk about the unique trials that Montanans went through in a bit. Interestingly enough, there wasn't a whole lot of time for celebration. As a segue from celebrations, that fall of 1918 is when the Spanish influenza hit in full force. People in Glendive, Montana were living in isolation and quarantine to control it, but they came out to celebrate the armistice, and they had another wave of the Spanish flu. So things are a little rough. Within days, it seems, the country and Montanans started building war memorials. But aside from the Spanish influenza, we've got drought that begins in Montana years before it hits the rest of the Great Plains. Montana begins losing populations, and I mean huge. Just for example, Fergus County in the 1920 census, they go from 28,000 people to the next decade, there's 16,000 in Fergus County. And then, of course, we have our progressives. All right. Not a whole lot of time to celebrate, sadly. So the first person I'm going to talk about is this amazing man by the name of Samuel Stewart. Now, for those of you that like to hang out with the Historical Society crew, Sam Stewart is known for his family of 3 daughters, and they were the first governor's family to live in what we consider the original governor's mansion. And his daughters and his wife have left some wonderful reminiscences. Now, what's amazing with Governor Stewart is that he is governor, and it's amazing that he he didn't just disappear one day and head for the Bahamas or the Yak or wherever a person would disappear in 1918. But he has a special session going into World War I. And then he holds a special session in 1919 and has our legislators return to Helena to figure out how to survive this incredible depression that Montana has fallen into. So we know many of us who, if you've been through the exhibit, gentlemen, if you've been through the exhibit, you know that that special session, the first one, was in response to our entrance into World War I. And some really amazing things came out of that, and some really not so great things came out of that. One of the things that is indicative of the progressive era is the fact that everybody needs to be the same. And there was a really definite definition and idea of what a patriot was. And I got to tell you, that homesteader next door who spoke German was not the idea of the ideal patriot. Coming out of that special session, we have sedition laws. We have the Council of Defense, which was a national organization, but Montana's Council of Defense and a couple others in the South, it's always interesting how we often parallel the South. I know, it's weird. That's another lifetime of study. But they were originally created to manage the flow of food, which makes sense in an agricultural state. We've got troops that need food. We've got farmers that need to get their food to the troops. And then we've got a whole population to feed. And so the Council of Defense was created to manage the flow of food and produce. The Council of Defense in Montana took on a whole lot more. They made certain that everybody in their county, there were chairmen in all of the counties that existed at that time. There were chairmen making certain that their constituents were acting patriotic. And if you've been in Montana for some years, you'll recall that Governor Schweitzer pardoned those people who did time. And honestly, this is no kidding. There were men in prison because they got liquored up. This was right before Prohibition. And badmouthed the U.S. or badmouthed the governor. And if that were happening today, I can tell you that the women that I have coffee with and sometimes wine, we'd be doing time right now. So, he then gets the state through World War I, and the bottom drops out. According to one of the history books of Montana, 20,000 homesteaders lost their homes. 20,000. Now, what that means is that those men and women who are losing their homesteads were not able to pay the money they owed the banks because during the war they'd been encouraged to increase their property holdings, to buy fancy equipment, and plant more. So we get a domino effect here where it's drought, there's no longer a market for all that wonderful wheat and potatoes, and Montanans were growing everything. The beef. So there's no market, and now we have banks closing down. And Montanans are in a world of hurt. So Sam Stewart calls another extraordinary session, just I think it's 17 months after the one preparing the state for war. And now he calls our lawmakers back and asks them to come up with a series of laws and legislation. I'm just having a hard time with that word today. that will help the people who are remaining in Montana. So, he specifically asked for drought relief and immediate aid for farmers. He asked for the creation of a state relief commission with branches in every county. And he wants administrative reform for the way road contracts and labor are given out. He wants, rather than big contractors coming in, he wants that system abolished, and he wants locals hired for labor, which makes sense. In response to his call, believe it or not, that group of men, were there women at that time, Becca? Were there a couple women in there? I want to say 1 or 2 women. I should have looked that up. They passed 58 measures. And they do give relief to farmers. They establish the State Highway Commission. They outline the powers and duties of that commission. And they pass bills funding highway improvement. And you can see what's important. They pass several laws having to do with water control and disbursement, because we're in a drought. So this man, wow. So let's make a change. This lovely lady is Mary Frances Connor. And she and her family come to Montana a little late. A little late. She and her husband prove up on their first claim in 1918. Ouch. Later, she files for her own homestead in 1926, and she successfully proves up on this. It's really amazing. But what has caught my eye about Mrs. Connor is the fact that her coping skill was a diary that was written in poetry. So here is one of her pages. She's talking about a neighbor. Soon Mr. Walker goes with family of 8 to try his fortune in another state. Faithfully he worked to sow the seeds, hoping thereby to supply their needs. Now his fields are bald and bare, the work of the cutworm showing there. That's a page of her diary. This is fascinating. Well, I like it anyway. What's that? Oh, yeah. She wound up teaching school in the area. Her homestead was adjacent, very consciously and deliberately, adjacent to her son's because, of course, they had a better chance of making it the more land they had. And she talks about, several times, she does talk about her son. But here's a couple more verses I'm going to share with you. Be sure I get back to where I'm at here. Okay. That was Mr. Walker. 1921, January 17th. This morning came so bright and glowing, with even the dogs fiercely showing, with sun dogs fiercely showing. But nothing more to cause alarm. Soon all the air grew nice and warm. I'm not sure I believe that. So roll along the times from which come all these rhymes. The school is so dear, I love it better every year. I love to note the interest taken, the desire to learn, I love to waken. Today I sent to Ruby a tea and a hope to seek her soon again. This evening 3 were here to eat. Mr. Connor filled the empty seat. She and her husband eventually separated. Montana is of trees quite bare. The joy of trees we may not share. Such scenery, on the other hand, is not surpassed in any land. For beauty, look toward the setting sun, and then you've only just begun. this evening at just about 4, Bob came knocking at the door. It's her son. He needed money, he had to tell, but then I knew it very well. I gave him money for his seeds. He did not like giving into this greed, for Bob has done his very best, and I must help him with the rest. Just amazing. She lived to be, I believe, 66, and she was teaching school up until the very last years or so of her life. Right. So Mary Connor. Now, the next is, how much time do I have? 11:30? Oh, duh. So in those days, it's important to remember, and this gets confusing when I read history, that the Republicans were the liberals and the Democrats were the conservatives. Okay? And there's some really great books out on the history of the Republican Party and that transition that took place in the 50s and 60s. Okay? So, Montana had had a string of Democratic or conservative governors. After Stewart's second term, Montanans elected their first Republican in several years. Again, Republican, this guy's a liberal. Okay, a little more on the left than he is on the right. And historians consider his 4 years in the governor's office as the end of Montana's progressive era. And we're going to talk about that because one of his passions was getting big business to pay taxes. Now, I want you to imagine an attorney. I believe he practiced law in Missoula. Let me make sure before I say that. Yes. He was the county attorney for Missoula County, and then he was a legislator. Then he went to U.S. Congress and the U.S. Senate. And amazingly, he served as the national chairman for the Progressive National Committee. Right? So, this was what he set out to do. The matter of fair and just taxation must be settled so that the great mining interests, the water power interests, and all other forms of property shall bear their equitable proportion of the burdens of government, no more and no less. Now, with that said, we were talking earlier about the corporations. So I want you to imagine the hell his life must have been for the next 4 years. Especially with those newspapers, and there were a lot of them, owned by the corporations. They crucified this man. And he was relatively popular with the public, but again, the newspapers time and time again lambasted him. He went up against the company, for lack of a different term. He tried to get this passed during 2 sessions of the legislature with no luck because the administrators did not want to go up, or excuse me, the legislators did not want to go up against the company. And it's not just the Anaconda Copper Company. There's the power company. There were companies that were controlling water. It just goes on and on. But ironically then, he loses his bid for another term in 1924. But that same year, There is an initiative 28 to have corporations taxed, and it is won overwhelmingly across the state. So his goal was realized, but probably not in the way that he had envisioned. So that is one of the huge steps, his administration of Montana getting rid of that Gilded Age, what was left of it, and starting to grow into the modern age of government and taxation. Okay. He wound up being second in command for the Department of Interior for Herbert Hoover. And he returned to Missoula in 1933, and he passed away shortly after. He was survived by his wife, and God bless him, as if life wasn't hard enough, 6 daughters. Okay. Any questions so far that I can answer? No? Okay. So I hope I made... I remember hearing, oh my gosh, when I was in high school, how Montanans had sent more men to the Army than any other state and blah, blah, blah. Quite honestly, I really didn't believe it. Because when I start hearing most, more, the first, the best, I always have to question it. Because in my career, I've learned that grammar is often wrong. And you need to tell me what you mean by the first or the best, because that's like who's on second and what's on third. But this is the document. This is a photocopy of the document coming out of the Adjutant General's office reporting on the numbers the federal government screwed up in going into the draft and enlistments of World War I. And you really do have to believe it. Gosh, you're not quoting me or anything, are you? Oh, okay. So, oh, I sure do. Excellent. Oh my gosh. How many more do you need? Just one? Miss Becca, you've seen this. All right. More needed? That's the question. Because the people coming up with the numbers screwed up. Do you have any other interpretation, Kirby? They screwed up. And Montanans rolled with it. And they were very proud of that. So again, there's all these interesting cycles going on. So imagine being a homesteader whose son is serving overseas, and you've got a neighbor or someone behind you at the general store that can only speak German. Imagine the dynamics going on in our little communities, or for that matter, some of our larger communities, where you've got the Irish, and quite honestly, the Irish not so fond of the English. And yet they have to be patriotic. There's so much going on in Montana during those years. It's phenomenal. It is this progressive era going to the end of Dixon's years as governor is my favorite era in Montana history. There's just so much going on. We've got thousands and thousands and thousands of homesteaders showing up. And if they were lucky enough to get here, let's say in the 1890s or 1900, chances are they may have enough money socked away to survive the drought. But if they got here in 1915, 1918, life was going to be very hard. And we lost those people. They headed, many of them, for the West Coast. They just went somewhere where they could find food for their families. Okay. So the notations here are mine, because if you read 5 books with the numbers of Montanans who have died, you're going to have 5 different totals. It's just the nature of the beast and history. Those darn historians can't agree on anything. And so I did this for this program, as a matter of fact. But I'm trying to remember how I came up with 1,400. We had 1,439 Montana casualties. Now that includes those men and women who would have died from the flu or any other illness. And we had a lot of boys die. They'd hit boot camp, there'd be the Spanish flu, and they would never see service. So I want, again, imagine 1,400 families in mourning. And this lovely lady won my heart. I want you to meet Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair. They lived in Baker. Originally, they came to the state and homesteaded, and they must have been successful because they sold the homestead and then wound up moving to Baker, and he had been a blacksmith in their earlier life, and he became a blacksmith again. Well, their son Harold was in the 127th Infantry, and he served in France. And he did not come home. And he is one of over 30,000, don't quote me on that. He is one of thousands of U.S. boys and men who did not come home, but was buried overseas. So a little bit of 1918 pop culture, for lack of a different term. You've seen that movie where, it's just terrible, but it's about the, is it the Hennessy's? The family of boys, there are like 4 or 5 boys, and they all go down on the same ship. What was the name of that? Say again? They were Irish. Might have been, but one of the things I took away from that movie was that their mother had a flag in the window with 5 blue stars, and mothers who had sons serving were issued flags to hang in the window so people would know that there was a young man or an older man, for that matter, serving. When that person died, they were issued a gold star. And that system was created by President Wilson. Because there were so many men buried overseas, we've got thousands and thousands of families who are not allowed that part of the grieving process of visiting the graves. And so going into the 20s and coming out of the 20s, a group is created called the Gold Star Mothers, and the government, the federal government, gives money to allow mothers, wives, relatives to visit the graves. And Mrs. Sinclair was one of those women. There were 69 women out of 1,400, 69 women from Montana taking part in this program. Now, what's amazing with Mrs. Sinclair is that Baker newspaper is so amazing, and she documents her trip over there and back. And it's lovely. She has what she describes as a great trip. The mothers are treated like gold by the government. like VIPs, as they should be. And she was able to visit Harold's grave. So I chose 66 women from Montana were eligible in 1929. But I chose the Sinclair family because she left behind her story, and not all of those Gold Star mothers did. But they represent that part of Montana that was not just recovering from depression, economic depression and drought, but recovering from their grief and loss. And that is often lost, I think, in the equation. So kudos to this amazing family. When she passed away, she left behind 2 other children and a whole bunch of grandchildren, I'm glad to say. So I can't help but smile at that. Her husband outlived her by quite a while. And he had to have been one heck of a guy because he just kept on going and was a blacksmith well into his 60s. So the Sinclairs and the Gold Star mothers. No questions yet? Oh. Forget. What's that?
How could the government estimate that we had almost twice as many as the actual population
That's a good question.
eligible for the draft?
They had a different calculator.
Oh, boy, did they? I thought everybody,
So another question is why didn't our adjutant general respond and say, wait a minute, we don't have that kind of population here? It's a mystery.
then were they given a quota that they were supposed to try to meet?
Oh yeah,
They were.
based on that 900,000. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Too, they might have done rationing, and if you had doubled the population, you got more rations.
Oh, I've never thought of that. Bonnie, did you have thoughts? That's good.
No, not enough.
Uh-huh.
Where did she go? Where's her son buried? Do you know?
He was in, not the Argonne, just a minute, I've got it somewhere. Shoot. The Battle of the Argonne. No, it's all right. Try to have all those little bits and pieces written down. But yeah. But the rationing, actually, that makes perfect sense. But I will ask colleagues. I've never heard of an excuse or a reason. It happened, and Montana went with it. Bobby?
What do you mean about rationing?
Well, I think back then you were allowed so much gas, so much sugar, flour, and many times you had to have stamps for that.
That was in World War II.
Yeah, was it World War I too? Or one also?
Forced on us. Herbert Hoover decided it would be more effective to convince us to conserve food items and things like that than to force us. So we were pressured and highly encouraged to conserve food and that, but it wasn't required.
Well, would more come to our state because we had a bigger population if they were allocating and then it was available for sale?
Well, since they weren't allocating in World War I.
Thank you, Bobby. But I think I'm wondering if that population number did somehow prove to our benefit, and that's worth looking into. Yeah. Will you do that for us? Yeah. Because there it does. So rationing was like patriotism. In fact, that's how women proved their patriotism, was by serving, not having meat on Mondays. So meatless Mondays, and what else was there? Flourless Fridays, and oh my gosh, we've got 3 cookbooks that have survived from 1918, and they have some amazing recipes. Some of them sound awful, others not so bad. But some of them, Scotch broth, just broth made out of pretty much anything you can put in it. But the oatmeal, I'm trying to think. One of my favorite stories with the rationing, as long as we're onto this, is from Evelyn Cameron. And so I've often, imagine being on a productive farm, and traditionally, of course, we would imagine that we're exporting everything, but that's not the case. We might not have enough chickens to worry about getting the eggs to market. We've got a milk cow. That's got to be used up right away. But Evelyn Cameron, in one of her entries during this time, goes to a party at a neighbor's. They have ice cream. They have ice cream. They have cake. They have this and that. And then at the end of this list of this feast, she said, Mr. Hoover would not have approved. So this Hooverizing, as it is called, was in the back of everybody's mind. That was one of the most successful propaganda programs probably in the history of the U.S. And what's your favorite story for rationing? You probably got 100 of them.
Yeah, I do. What was interesting is because we were supposed to be saving the wheat, and we raised wheat here in Montana with twice as many boys being gone. We were short the ice harvesters. There were some ladies that were really angry at the government for drafting all the men right when the wheat needed to be harvested. So there was all those little difficulties.
Oh, see, it's just
About that many men being gone. That's
so
a big hole.
complex, so complex. Ice harvesting is one of my favorite topics. Bonnie laughs. I mean, can you imagine how many winters through the eons men are harvesting ice? And then they're hauled to the ice house, packed in sawdust, and distributed to women who have ice boxes. Not refrigerators, ice boxes. So that labor is gone. But Evelyn did have connections, and they had ice cream. So imagine a ranch or homestead that's got an ice house. Ah, that's where I want to be. Okay. Hooverizing is for another day. All right. Doggone it. Let's do it. Do it wrong. Ah. Renan. Oh, heck with it. Let's do this. No. Don't come down, Renan. I'm fine. We'll figure it out. Sure I will. There, nope. Okay. There we go. Okay. Oh, it didn't change. Oh. Well, on here it looks fine. You thought I was just being happy because I was crazy. All right.
Oops, there went.
There it is. All right. So my hope for this program was to introduce 4 incredibly different people. You've got a Democratic governor and you've got a Republican governor. By the way, there wouldn't be another Republican governor, I think, for 22 years or 24 years. I think it was Ford was the next one. So we have a culture that's in grieving. We've got homesteaders that are struggling for their very lives. We have a mass exodus. We have an amazing woman whose coping skill is poetry in her diary. We have so many amazing characters in Montana's history. And for me, that is my favorite way to learn about history, is looking at those individuals. So I hope that I've instilled in you at least a little idea of how amazingly dynamic that time in Montana history was, but how many heroes have prepared the way for us to live in this wonderful state. Whether they were grieving, politicians who were after wanted those companies to pay taxes, right? Homesteaders, they are our ancestors. And I have to say thank you very much for coming out today because it's cold. Okay, questions? Oh, you got that.